The year was 1821. The winds over the English moors carried not only mist, but a silence that seemed older than the stones themselves. And within that silence, men whispered of an omen so dreadful that even the clergy refused to put it to paper. It was called simply the Blackmoor Omen, a phrase that lingered like smoke in the minds of those who dared repeat it. 9 bloodlines, ancient and entangled, bound by land, wealth, and unspeakable vows, were said to be chosen by fate or by something far older than fate. Each family marked by sigils hidden in their own coats of arms, symbols that even heraldry scholars would not decipher aloud. And in the year 1821 that hidden design came into play, for the omen demanded sacrifice, not of enemies, but of their own. 9 bloodlines, 9 sacrifices, 9 years of silence. That was the pattern whispered in darkened taverns of Yorkshire, in country churches where the priests spoke in veiled tones, in private studies where documents were burned after reading, and yet the pattern survived in fragments, in journals, in testimonies of those who did not live long after speaking it, for silence was the true currency of survival. The first sign came not in death, but in sound, a ringing bell that was not of any church tower, described as hollow and metallic, echoing across the valley of Blackmoor on a moonless night in March. No one admitted to striking it, yet every man and woman within 10 miles swore they heard it. And when the dawn rose, a child from the Whitlock family was missing from his cradle. From that moment, fear took root like iron. The villagers knew the Whitlocks were one of the 9, their bloodline old, tied to Norman conquest and to deeds most would rather forget. And when the priest was summoned, he muttered only that the bell had been tolled, that the first had been claimed, and that the rest must prepare. For this was no accident of fate, but an agreement renewed. The Blackmoor Omen was not prophecy in the usual sense. It was a ledger, an ancient account demanding payment, and once the first life was taken, the tally had begun, and silence, terrible, suffocating silence, was all that remained. The silence that followed the Whitlock child's disappearance weighed upon Blackmoor heavier than the heather mist. Yet the valley knew it would not remain still for long. For omens do not come in singular acts, they come in chains, and chains demand their links. So when the second toll was heard 9 months later, colder and deeper than the first, the villagers did not ask who struck it. They only waited to learn which family would be named next. It was the Harrow family, one of the most entrenched landowners of the northern moors, known for their sprawling stone estate, whose windows watched the valley like unblinking eyes. Their patriarch, Lord Alistair Harrow, had long boasted that his line was untouchable, that no curse nor legend could ever stain their name. Yet it was in his own household that the second sacrifice was drawn. His daughter Margaret, barely 12 years old, vanished from her locked chamber on the very night the phantom bell rang. The details, whispered in court records that were later sealed, described her bed neatly made, her shoes arranged at the foot, her diary left open with a single unfinished line, "He calls." Words scrawled in a hand trembling so violently the ink bled across the page. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the hall, no broken locks, only that echo of the bell still resonating in the ears of those who claimed to hear it, long after it should have faded. The Harrows attempted to silence the matter with money, paying off servants, bribing constables, threatening anyone who dared suggest that the family had been marked, yet no silver could erase the truth. 2 families gone, 7 more awaited. The pattern was undeniable, and the ledger, if that is what it was, had only just begun its tally. What unsettled the valley most was not the loss itself, but the fact that Lord Harrow, so fiery in public, withdrew completely after his daughter's disappearance. Some said he spent nights pacing the east wing of the manor, clutching old scrolls, said to be older than the estate itself. Others said he had struck bargains long ago, and that the omen had come to collect. The silence after the second toll was thicker, darker, no longer disbelief but dread. For now the valley knew 7 more would be claimed, and there was nothing any man of faith, wealth, or power could do to stop it. By the time the third toll came, there was no pretense of disbelief left in Blackmoor. The valley awaited it like condemned men awaiting the hangman's rope. And when it rang, low and hollow, on the eve of midsummer in 1823, they knew at once another family had been chosen. This time, it was the Fenwicks, a line less wealthy than the Harrows, but older, tied not to vast estates, but to something stranger. They had long been known as keepers of the hidden archives, manuscripts and relics guarded in their crumbling manor's library, volumes whispered to date back to the dissolution of the monasteries, books that priests had refused to bless, books that nobles had paid dearly to erase. And when the toll came, the family's second son, Thomas, was found lifeless in his bed with no wound, no sign of struggle, his eyes wide open and his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The coroner, a cautious man, noted in his private papers that Thomas's heart bore the mark of a circle burned into the flesh, as though seared from within, not carved from without. Yet when the report was delivered to the parish records, no mention of such a mark remained. It had been erased, cleansed, as though the truth itself was too dangerous to set down in ink. The villagers whispered that the Fenwicks had always been close to the heart of the omen. Their ancestors said to have sworn oaths in the shadow of the old Blackmoor chapel centuries earlier, oaths sealed not with blood spilled in battle, but with blood offered willingly. Yet none could name the price that was promised, only that now, in this generation, the debt had come due. It was after Thomas Fenwick's death that the valley began to see the pattern as a ledger, 9 bloodlines, each to lose one, each to fall silent for a year, then again and again, until 9 had been taken in 9 years, and the ledger closed. Some said the silence itself was the power, that no protest, no wailing, no accusation could be spoken aloud, that silence was both punishment and proof of compliance. Yet though the families obeyed outwardly, though their voices were hushed, the villagers noticed changes, curtains drawn tighter, torches burned later, prayers whispered not to God, but to shadows. For now it was clear, the Blackmoor Omen was not legend, it was law. When the 4th toll came, it was no longer unexpected. The villagers had begun to mark their calendars with dread, counting the months until the hollow bell would sound again, and when it did in the autumn of 1824, the chosen family was the Mortimers, a house older than parchment records, their lineage traced not by ink, but by standing stones that still crowned the hills above their estate, stones carved with spirals and runes that no priest dared consecrate. The Mortimers had always been regarded with unease, their ancestral home known less as a manor and more as a keep, its walls blackened with age, its hearths burning with a flame that never seemed to die out. The villagers claimed the Mortimers were tied not to the church, but to something older, rites whispered in the dark of solstice nights, oaths sealed not with holy water, but with earth and ash. And when the bell tolled, their heir, Richard Mortimer, was found at the base of one of those stones, his body unmarked, yet his eyes clouded white, as if the life within had been drawn out. A parish curate recorded in his diary that when he was called to the scene, he saw faint carvings glowing upon the stone, symbols far older than Latin, symbols resembling those upon the Fenwick manuscripts. Yet before he could copy them, a storm rose suddenly over the moor, lightning shattering one of the lesser stones, rain washing the carvings away, as though the land itself refused to let them be recorded. By morning the curate's diary vanished, his household claiming he burned it himself, though no ashes were ever found. The Mortimers kept their silence as the pattern demanded, yet those closest to the family whispered of nightly vigils, of Lord Mortimer kneeling before the stones with bloodied hands, not in grief, but in renewal, as though he feared not the loss of his son, but the breaking of an oath much older than Christianity itself. It was this 4th death that led scholars in later years to suspect that the 9 bloodlines were bound by something pre-Christian, perhaps a pact formed in the shadow of Britain's pagan past, when blood was not spilled in war, but offered to powers that demanded renewal every generation. And if such a pact had been sealed, then the sacrifices of 1821 through 1829 were not accidents of fate, but the scheduled payment of an ancient debt that no descendant could escape. By the time the 5th toll came in the spring of 1825, The omen had shifted from dread to inevitability. The valley no longer asked if another child would vanish or perish, only which family would bear the mark next. And when the bell rang, hollow as ever, the tragedy fell upon the Aldcrofts, a family of merchants whose influence stretched into London's counting houses, men of ledgers and contracts who had believed wealth and reason would shield them from superstition. Their chosen victim was Jonathan Aldcroft, the youngest son at only 8 years old, his body found seated upright at the family table, untouched meal before him, eyes closed as if in gentle rest. Yet no breath filled his lungs, no warmth lingered in his skin, and in his clenched hand he held a strip of parchment no larger than a coin, upon which a single spiral had been drawn in ink, so dark it seemed to absorb the candlelight around it. The family attempted to conceal the parchment, but servants spoke of it in whispers, and soon the rumour spread that Jonathan had not been taken by chance, but by summons, as though his blood had been called into the ledger. The Aldcrofts brought physicians from London, men trained in the newest sciences, yet each left bewildered, claiming no disease, no poison, no rational cause could account for what they had seen. It was after this fifth death that murmurs of investigation began among the surviving bloodlines. The remaining families could no longer comfort themselves with denial. They began scouring their archives, unearthing wills, journals, fragments of correspondence dating back centuries. And what they found was more unsettling than silence. For each bloodline bore records of a single gathering, a meeting of ancestors in the year 1313 in the shadow of the old chapel ruins, records vague yet consistent, speaking of vows made for prosperity, protection, and dominion. Over the valley, vows sealed not before God, but before what was called the Keeper of Silence. The more they uncovered, the less they spoke aloud. Some destroyed what they found, others locked their discoveries in vaults. But the knowledge spread in fragments, enough to poison sleep and gnaw at reason. For if their ancestors had indeed sealed a covenant centuries earlier, then the sacrifices of the omen were not punishment. They were fulfillment, and resistance was not only futile but forbidden. The bell had claimed 5, 4 yet remained, and the valley knew now with certainty. The tally was no accident. It was an inheritance. By the autumn of 1826, the valley had learned to live beneath the shadow of its curse, yet a flicker of rebellion stirred within the Harrowell bloodline, a family of ironmasters whose foundries fueled half the county, men who believed in fire and steel, in the power of industry to bend the world rather than bow before it. When the bell tolled for the 6th time, they swore their line would not bend, their sons would not be offered, and if the valley's silence demanded another child, it would be denied. Their choice was William Harrowell, a boy of 14, eldest of his generation, already apprenticed to his father's trade. The family kept him from school, locked him within the manor's strongest chamber, surrounded him with guards, iron bars on every window, fires burning day and night so that no cold shadow could creep in. Prayers and charms were forbidden, for the Harrowells believed only in human will, not the mutterings of clergy or the whispers of witches. Yet on the 7th night of William's confinement, the guards heard nothing. No footstep, no struggle, no cry for help. When they entered the chamber, they found him lying on the iron floor as though laid down by unseen hands, his face pale, eyes open, but lips sewn shut. Not by thread or twine, but by something no blade could sever, as if the very flesh had grown into silence, sealing every word, every plea, every defiance inside him. And within his fist was a shard of blackened slag, not from any forge in the Harrowell works, its texture alien, its surface marked with the same spiral inked upon the parchment found with Jonathan Aldcroft. The Harrowells raged, declaring they would expose the truth, they would summon magistrates, even Parliament itself if need be. But when they tried to speak in the square, their voices faltered, words dried in their throats, as though the curse had not only silenced William but chained their own tongues. The valley watched in terror, realizing that resistance was not only impossible but punishable, not just in blood, but in voice, in the very power to name what stalked them. The 6th son was gone, and with him any illusion of control. The covenant of silence was older, stronger, more absolute than steel. The Harrowells had dared to resist, and they had been answered, not with mercy, but with mockery. By the winter of 1827, dread hung so heavy upon the valley that even the air itself seemed to weigh down the chest. Each family of the 7 lines had lost 6 sons, the toll unbroken, each death as precise as a clock striking the hour. And now every household fixed its eyes upon the last boy, the 7th heir, the final breath of a lineage, and whispers spread like smoke that if the covenant demanded 7 for 7, then this was the night when the seal would close. The Aldcrofts watched over Thomas, their youngest, a child of only 9 summers, pale and delicate, with eyes too old for his years. They swaddled him in wool, laid charms of salt and iron across his bed, placed candles in every window of the house, for the priests had given up their rites, the witches their herbs, and only ritual itself remained. Desperate and directionless. In the Harrowell forge the hammers ceased. In the caraway fields the ploughs were left standing. In the Harrington Hall the servants barred the doors. Every house waiting, praying, listening. But the night did not come with thunder, nor with fire. Instead it came with a silence so complete that even the owls stilled in their trees. No breath of wind stirred, no sound of river, only a vacuum, a hollowing of the world, and within that silence Thomas stirred from his bed, his eyes glazed white, his lips parting though no sound escaped, his small hand clutching the spiral-marked shard that no one had placed in his palm. His body moved as though drawn by strings unseen, down the stair, past the frozen faces of his kin, out into the courtyard where every family had gathered, unable to stop him, unable even to speak, for their throats closed like the Harrowells before them. The boy stood in the centre, arms raised to a sky without stars, and there the covenant claimed him, not with blood spilled nor breath stolen, but with a collapse, as if his flesh folded inward, his frame crumpling into dust that scattered across the stones like ash from a fire long dead. And in the silence that followed, a voice was heard, not aloud, not carried by air, but within each skull, a single word, a single command, older than their tongue, heavier than their blood. It said only this: begin. When the dust of Thomas Aldcroft drifted away on the still air, the gathered families collapsed to their knees, not in prayer, but in something closer to paralysis, as if the marrow inside their bones had turned to stone. They had waited for the covenant to close, for the curse to finish its counting, for the grief to finally exhaust itself. But instead, the silence deepened, stretching not for minutes but for hours, until it became unbearable, a silence that did not merely fill the valley, but seemed to spread outward, as though the rest of the world had been struck mute. By dawn, the villagers discovered that every clock had stopped at the same moment, the exact hour when Thomas crumbled into ash. The tower bells would not strike, the river would not flow, the mill wheel stood stiff though no hand restrained it, and those who tried to speak found their words mangled, their voices cracking into sounds that resembled no human language, only jagged syllables that made their throats bleed. And so they resorted to silence, to writing with shaking hands, for to speak was to invite something inside. The valley elders gathered in Harrington Hall, the only place large enough to hold them, and upon the table they laid the remnants of the shard Thomas had clutched, its spiral deeper now, as if it had carved itself further inward, impossibly sharp, impossibly dark, and each elder swore that when they stared too long, they saw motion within it. Not reflection, but movement, as though something behind it pressed against the surface of the world, impatient, waiting, testing the veil. The women wept without tears, their eyes burning dry. The men sat in silence, every 7th chair at the table left empty, for there were no sons left to inherit, and yet their grief could not gather into mourning, for mourning requires finality, and here finality had been denied. Instead they felt a read realization creeping into every corner of their minds. The covenant had not ended with 49 deaths. It had only cleared the path, stripped the bloodlines bare. hollowed the valley until it could receive whatever pressed now from the other side. And though no one spoke it aloud, every man, woman, and child carried the same thought like a hidden stone in the gut. The word they had heard, the command that rang inside their skulls, it was not a conclusion. It was a beginning. The valley did not wake on the second morning. It shivered, the air thick with something that resembled breath, yet belonged to no creature they knew. The mist that curled between the pines did not disperse with the sun. Instead it seemed to cling, resisting light, swallowing it. And the farmers who dared to step outside found the earth beneath their boots soft, as if flesh had grown where soil once was, a pulsing that sickened their balance, a rhythm that echoed their own heartbeats until they staggered back indoors, clutching their chests. Children who had not yet spoken a word since the death of Thomas Aldcroft began to murmur in unison, not in the broken syllables that had shredded their parents' throats, but in a smooth chant, low, steady, almost gentle, a language no one recognized yet all understood at once. And the words were not comfort. They were instructions. The little ones raised their hands toward the hills and spoke of doors beneath the stone, of names older than their bloodlines, of a master who had been waiting through 49 deaths for the gate to finally split open. The livestock bellowed and shrieked as if pierced by invisible blades, sheep slamming themselves against fences until bones snapped, horses frothing at the mouth, eyes rolling white. And when the villagers slaughtered them out of mercy, they found that the hearts had already been removed, not cut out, but absent, as if they had never existed. And the carcasses collapsed into husks lighter than air, drifting almost like paper before crumbling into the same grey ash that had once been Thomas. By evening the elders returned to the shard, only to find that it had grown, no longer a fragment, but a jagged wheel larger than the table, its spirals now reaching the floor, carving grooves into the wood, though no hand touched it. And when the firelight flickered across its surface, the shadows be. Not unnaturally, elongating not away from the shard but toward it, pulled as if the thing were drinking light, drinking time, drinking life itself. No one dared to name what they now feared, but the truth was plain. The covenant was not a curse upon sons. It was a construction, a foundation built upon blood, and the 49 had been nothing more than stones laid to form a threshold, and now the threshold quivered, waiting, ready to open. On the third night the valley did not sleep. There was no stillness, no pause, no space for silence. The mist pressed against the windows like a tide, filling the lungs of the houses, and when the villagers lit candles, the flames did not rise upward, but bent sideways, drawn toward the hills where the shard had been hidden, as if the very breath of the earth demanded witness to what was about to begin. At the Aldcroft Manor, the doors rattled against their hinges, though no wind stirred. The floor trembled as if giant steps echoed from below, deeper than the cellar, deeper than stone, and the family gathered in the hall with torches, knowing they had no choice but to return to the chamber. For the threshold that had been prepared through blood would not wait. It summoned its witnesses, and denial was no longer possible. When they reached the shard, they found it had fused with the ground itself, no longer an object but a structure, a circle vast enough to fill the chamber. The spiral stretched wide, its edges carved into the very earth, and within it lay not darkness but movement, a slow, undulating shimmer, a surface that was not water, but memory itself. Reflections not of their own faces, but of the 49 boys staring back with hollow eyes, mouths sewn shut, their hands pressed against the barrier as though begging release. A sound rose from within, not thunder and not voice, but something between both, a resonance that shook bone and marrow. The children in the room screamed as one, yet their cries were not human. They fractured into tones that formed a pattern, the same pattern engraved in the shard, the same rhythm that had pulsed in the soil. And when the villagers covered their ears, they realized the sound was not heard but felt, an invasion of thought, a rewriting of will. The spiral blazed with pale fire, cold and searing at once, and a seam split open across, as its center. slow, deliberate, a wound in the earth, and through that wound came not a form but a shadow, vast and unmeasured, an outline that shifted, shoulders bending into wings, eyes forming, then dissolving, a presence too large to fix in shape. And though no name was spoken, every soul in the room knew what stood at the gate. It was not a curse. It was not grief. It was arrival. The chamber fell still as if breath itself had been stolen. Every torch bent inward toward the spiral as though fire itself bowed, and from the seam rose a pressure like the weight of oceans pressing against fragile ribs. No one dared speak. No one dared move. For the shadow was no longer a shape, but a presence filling the marrow of the room, demanding not worship, but recognition. A whisper threaded through the silence, soft yet piercing. Not sound but thought made audible. It slid into the skull like a key through a lock, and every man and woman heard the same words, though no lips had moved. Not the priests, not the family, not the children. The voice was not born of any mouth. It came from the breach itself, the wound in the spiral, and its first word was mine. The villagers staggered, clutching at their temples, some dropping to their knees, for the word was not a claim but a sentence, a binding. It pressed itself into their bones, and the shadow unfolded further, wings stretching against the ceiling, though there was no ceiling high enough to contain it. Eyes flaring, then extinguishing like lanterns in a storm. Too many eyes, too few, always shifting, always watching. The priests raised their symbols, trembling, but the shadow laughed without laughter, a vibration that cracked the wood of the icons in their hands, splintering faith into dust. And then the voice returned, asking no question, granting no choice. I have taken 49, and through them I have measured your threshold. Now you will open wider, or you will be opened. The Aldcroft matriarch fell forward, her voice breaking, confessing what the family had hidden for generations, that they had been bound to the shard long before the deaths began, that their bloodline had been chosen as conduit, not cursed by chance but shackled by pact, and the shadow confirmed with silence, a silence that roared louder too. And truth itself, the children wept. Some tried to flee, but the spiral flared again, and the floor was no longer stone but mirror, reflecting not the villagers, but the figure each feared most. Mother, father, soldier, corpse, every surface a deception, every reflection a test, and the voice carved its words deeper into their hearts. What you call curse is covenant. What you call grief is seed. Now choose which will grow. The chamber no longer held a single people. It fractured like glass beneath a hammer. The villagers who had entered as one body of fear now found themselves split into two tides, one rushing toward defiance, the other collapsing into surrender, and between them the spiral glowed, pulsing with a rhythm that matched no heart, no drum, but something older, something unclaimed by flesh. Those who resisted clenched their fists, dragging children behind them, muttering prayers in broken Latin or in words so old their meaning had rotted away. They cursed the family, cursed the priests, cursed the spiral itself, shouting that no pact bound them, that no shadow could command their will. Yet their voices cracked, their hands trembled, and for every word of resistance, the silence of the spiral grew heavier, pressing their defiance into dust. The others, those who surrendered, did not kneel out of faith. They knelt out of exhaustion, the weight of the 49 graves too heavy, the years of loss too sharp, their faces hollow as if every tear should have carved another line into their skin. They pressed their palms against the floor, against the mirror surface, whispering that perhaps the shadow was right, that grief was only seed, and seed deserved to grow, even if it grew in darkness. The Aldcroft patriarch stood between them, torn. His voice thundered that the curse could be ended only if one path was chosen. Yet the shadow gave no instruction. It offered no map. It only widened the rift, feeding on division as if it were fuel, its presence expanding with every word of discord, with every fractured vow. Children clung to their mothers, asking if their brothers would return, if their fathers still walked the fields above. But no answer came. Only the reflection of faces they feared in the mirrored floor. Eyes widening, mouths contorting, until the children screamed and clawed at the iron skin to break the illusion. Yet the spiral fed on their panic, shining brighter with each shriek. The priests attempted command, but their scripture burned to ash before their mouths could shape it. Pages turned to cinders, smoke curling like serpents, and the shadow whispered again, not as word, but as commandment inscribed upon bone. The covenant deepens in choice. The fracture is the offering, division is the altar, and the altar is mine. The village was no longer one. It had become two tribes, one clinging to light, the other surrendering to shadow, both bound in the same spiral of ruin. The chamber shook not from earthquake, but from voices colliding, from rage ignited against surrender, from surrender hissing against defiance. And in that storm of words, the first hand rose not to shield but to strike. A man from the resisting line lunged, his fist breaking across the face of one who knelt, bone cracking like dry wood, and the mirrored floor drank the blood before it even struck the stone. The cry that followed was not human alone, it carried deeper, echoing like something released, something waiting for centuries to hear its chosen note. And the spiral pulsed brighter, as if violence were the true language it had hungered for all along. Panic split into fury. Those who resisted now turned their anger on the kneelers, shouting that they had betrayed their dead, that they had sold the names of the 49 sons for an empty promise of peace. They clawed, they struck, nails gouging, teeth tearing, as if war had been called, but no enemy existed except their own neighbors, their own kin. The kneelers answered not with submission, but with retaliation, the collapse of spirit replaced by an animal ferocity. They rose snarling, their eyes blank with shadow, striking with stones, with broken bone, with hands stiff as weapons, the air filled with the sound of screaming flesh, of families tearing themselves apart, of the spiral commanding without word or gesture, only pulsing its terrible rhythm into their skulls. The Aldcroft patriarch staggered into the center, his arms raised to halt them, but his voice drowned in the roar, his body shoved, trampled, until his face pressed against the mirror, where his reflection grinned back at him with teeth not his own, whispering curses that scalded his ears until he tore himself free, bleeding and shaking. Children wailed, pressed against walls slick with blood, watching mothers dragged by their hair, fathers beaten by, those they had shared bread with hours before, neighbors splitting skulls with farming tools, all beneath the watch of the spiral that pulsed like a heart of fire, the reflection of the chamber showing not villagers, but an army of shadows feeding on each drop spilled, and when the first corpse fell, jaw broken, ribs shattered, his body twitching against the mirror until it lay still, the shadow whispered, not in command, not in threat, but in satisfaction. The covenant drinks, the covenant binds, the covenant deepens. The chamber was now a battlefield, and the curse had taken its first true harvest of blood. What began as frenzy soon bent into something more ordered, though no voice gave direction, no hand pointed, no priest recited words. Yet the chaos began to take on form, each strike measured, each scream timed as though some hidden conductor wove madness into music, and the villagers became instruments, not men and women, but hollowed vessels spilling out blood for a score older than memory. One knelt not to pray, but to pin another to the floor, while three others struck in unison, their movements eerily precise, as if rehearsed in dreams they had never confessed. Bones broke in a rhythm, blood splashed in arcs that mirrored symbols drawn in secret texts, the spiral on the floor glowing with every strike, until it no longer reflected their faces, but displayed a vast, unseen congregation, clapping in silence from some depthless beyond. Children were not spared, but neither were they killed outright, their hands seized, their small palms dragged through the blood, forced to smear marks across the mirrored stone, each mark a crooked rune that shimmered before sinking into the spiral, binding them to what was unfolding. binding them to a curse they did not choose. The patriarch tried again to break the order, tearing one man back from the slaughter, but the villager's eyes were glass, his mouth twitching with words he did not form, and when he spoke it was not his tongue but another's, ancient and grinding, a voice that scraped like metal dragged across stone, promising the patriarch that resistance was already broken, that the dynasty had fed the covenant for centuries and would feed it still. Bodies piled, not randomly but in a circle, limbs positioned, faces tilted skyward, the dead made into offerings rather than victims, the spiral shimmering brighter with each placement, as if it consumed their essence before the flesh cooled, leaving their eyes dull, their mouths fraught. Zen in expressions of horror, the chamber became unrecognizable, not a hall of mourning but an altar drenched in living sacrifice, walls quivering with the pulse of the spiral, shadows climbing higher, feeding until their forms thickened into the suggestion of figures, tall, cloaked, faceless, watching the village tear itself apart in their name. And as the last scream broke into silence, the curse sealed itself deeper, no longer waiting for generations to pass, but burning itself into the marrow of the living, into the memory of the children, into the soil that would never forget. When at last the chamber fell still, the surviving villagers staggered upward through the stone passages, their feet dragging as though chained, though no irons clung to their ankles. The night air of Harrington lands met them not with freedom, but with a stifling weight, the silence of the fields pressing on them heavier than the darkness beneath. And though they emerged into open sky, none dared to breathe deeply, none dared to speak. Those who had seen the spiral burning on the floor could not unsee it. Its glow burned behind their eyelids even now, and every step they took across the grass left not footprints, but the faintest shadow of that symbol, invisible to the eye, yet felt in the marrow. The earth itself acknowledging what had been bound into it, the covenant fed again by blood and sealed again by silence. Children clung to their mothers, but not with the wailing fear of innocence. Their eyes had gone hollow, their hands stained with symbols they had been forced to draw. They no longer reached for comfort, but stood staring, as if listening to voices only they could hear. And when asked by trembling parents what they saw, the children turned away without answer. Already too far gone into the curse that had claimed them, the patriarch, bloodied but alive, stumbled into the courtyard of his ancestral home, yet no family greeted him. No servants rushed to his aid, for the house had emptied itself, as though sensing what had been dragged back to its door, and its windows reflected not light but darkness deeper than night, waiting for him to cross its threshold so it could claim what he had tried and failed to protect. Around the estate, lanterns burned but gave no warmth, their flames bending unnaturally as though pulled toward some unseen center. Dogs howled once, then fell silent forever, and the birds that had haunted the trees since time immemorial took flight. And a single black mass, abandoning the lands they had circled for generations, leaving behind a silence that no living thing dared to disturb. By dawn the villagers had scattered to their homes, yet no doors slammed, no voices called. Every hearth remained unlit, every path untrodden, and Harrington's soil seemed to pulse faintly as though fed by the bodies below. A new rhythm set, a curse that would echo not just through the dynasty, but through all who walked its land. By the season's turn, the Harrington name was no longer spoken with reverence. It passed instead from lip to lip like a contagion, each whisper carrying less respect and more fear. And though the dynasty still commanded wealth and land, its power had shifted, for where once people bowed out of loyalty, they now averted their eyes out of dread, as if to look upon a Harrington too long was to invite ruin into one's own home. Priests who had long accepted the family's donations to gild their altars now spoke in veiled tones, their sermons circling around words like abomination, covenant, and wrath, careful never to say the Harrington name aloud within their churches, but letting the implication hang heavy, their congregations nodding in grim silence, already convinced that the dynasty's bloodline had been touched by something that no blessing could cleanse. Neighbors in the nearby towns began marking their doors with symbols, crude scratches in the wood meant to ward off whatever force the Harringtons had brought upon themselves. and when traders passed by the estate they muttered prayers under their breath, refusing to let their wagons slow, lest even the shadow of the manor cling to them, for stories spread quickly of men who tarried too long at its gates only to fall sick within days. The dynasty's rivals, families who had once resented Harrington wealth, found themselves speaking with unusual caution. For while they despised their name, they also feared it. Rumours swirled that those who mocked the Harringtons openly did not last long. Their crops withered, their sons disappeared, their wives woke screaming in the night with visions of blood and chains, so even hatred had to be swallowed carefully, lest it invite the curse upon one's own. Letters sent abroad were returned unopened. Merchants who had once courted Harrington favour ceased correspondence, and even the Crow. Its envoys began withdrawing from dealings, claiming illness or divine guidance, as if some invisible line had been drawn around the dynasty's lands, cutting them off not by decree, but by the silent hand of fear. And in that isolation, the Harringtons found themselves both rulers of vast soil and prisoners upon it. The name itself became a weight, mothers warning children not to say it after dark, old men refusing to write it, and by the end of that year it was no longer spoken as lineage, but as curse. Harrington no longer meant power, it meant death dressed in inheritance. Behind the sealed doors of the Harrington estate, the family that once stood as a single, towering lineage began to fracture, for though they presented a united front to the outside world, within their halls suspicion festered, every death of a son casting a long shadow of blame across the faces of the surviving brothers and their wives, until trust itself was a corpse that no one dared bury. At first the whispers were small, questions muttered over candlelight about who had let the boy wander near the river, who had failed to watch the fevers in the night, who had spoken too freely of their sorrows before strangers. Yet soon these whispers hardened into accusations, sharpened by grief and made dangerous by pride. For each Harrington believed himself less cursed than betrayed, and the deaths became not only tragedies, but weapons in a private war. Wives clutched their children tighter, refusing to allow them into the care of other branches of the family, and when sons still living coughed or faltered, arguments erupted, voices echoing through the manor's stone halls, fathers shouting that another had wished ill upon their blood, mothers swearing that poison lingered in the kitchens or in the wine, the household staff caught in the crossfire of suspicion, their every gesture interpreted as treachery. Meals once grand and ceremonial shrank into tense gatherings, where silence was broken not by laughter, but by the scrape of knives and the cutting weight of stares, each Harrington watching the other, wondering who among them had consorted with forces beyond the family, who had bargained their sons to something unseen. And though no proof was ever found, the doubt itself was enough. It spread like fire, consuming every bond that once held them. Even the brothers themselves, once united by inheritance, shared blood and shared grief, began to move apart within the manor occupying different wings, refusing to cross each other's thresholds, each convinced that the deaths of his 7 sons were punishment for sins not of his own making, but of his kin. And so the curse turned them inward, sharpening their grief into suspicion, until they were no longer brothers, but wary strangers, bound by a rotting name. By the end of that year, the Harrington estate was no longer a home, but a battlefield of silences, its grand corridors heavy with the sound of locks turning, of doors closing, of voices lowered into secrecy. And in that isolation, blood turned against blood, as if the true curse had not been the loss of sons, but the destruction of trust itself. As the Harrington brothers tore each other apart behind locked doors, another terror unfolded within the walls of the estate, one more subtle yet no less damning, for the very servants upon whom the household depended began to vanish, slipping from existence as though claimed by the same unseen hand that had carried off the sons. At first it was dismissed as desertion, a scullery maid who failed to appear at dawn, a stable boy whose bed lay empty, their absence explained away as fear or cowardice. For the servants had always spoken in hushed tones of the curse, their voices thick with superstition. Yet as the days stretched into weeks, the disappearances multiplied. until it could no longer be denied that something was reaching even beyond the family bloodline. The estate's kitchens grew quieter. Halls once filled with bustling attendants now echoed with emptiness, lamps unlit, fires untended, and when questioned, the remaining staff muttered of shadows that moved where no one walked, of footsteps heard in the corridors long after curfew, of whispers that seemed to call them by name, promising safety if only they obeyed. But those who listened were never seen again. Soon, fear gripped the servants so tightly that they banded together at night, sleeping in locked clusters rather than alone. Yet even these precautions proved useless, for one by one they vanished from their beds, their companions waking to find the blankets folded neatly, the pillows cold. No trace of struggle, no sign of intrusion, as though the earth itself had opened to swallow them whole. Outside the estate, rumors spread like wildfire, tales told in taverns and markets of a household where both noble sons and common workers were fed to some insatiable hunger, where wages could not buy loyalty because no wage could buy survival. And soon, fewer and fewer dared answer the summons to serve the Harrington. Leaving the family stranded in their own isolation, bereft of the very hands that had once sustained their wealth. The few who remained, cooks, cleaners, guards, walked as though haunted, their eyes hollow, their breaths shallow, speaking only when commanded, for they knew what the brothers did not yet grasp, that whatever cursed the Harrington line had grown bold enough to devour anyone within reach, blood or not, and that the estate itself had become less a manor than a trap. The Harrington estate did not stand in silence, for beyond its gates the village of Dunswick had long watched the decline with wary eyes, and by the year's end, whispers that once fluttered through alehouses hardened into conviction. The people no longer doubted whether the family was cursed, but only how long it would take for that curse to spill into their own homes. Mothers pulled children from the paths that led toward the manor. Fathers who once sought Harrington coin now muttered that no fortune was worth the stain it carried. And the church bells rang with hollow defiance as priests warned their congregations not to consort with the dynasty, declaring that 7 brothers who buried 49 sons must surely have offended heaven itself, their name blackened by some hidden sin too great to speak aloud. Yet the villagers did speak, and louder with each disappearance, for they had noticed that the estate's servants, recruited from among their own kin, were not returning, their wages never collected, their letters never sent home, their voices silenced. And so the townsfolk began to gather at dusk, their meetings lit not by holy candles, but by fear, by the growing suspicion that the Harringtons were not victims at all, but perpetrators of something unspeakable. Markets closed earlier, windows were shuttered, and travellers who inquired about the manor were met with stares of warning, told to leave before nightfall, for the dynasty was now spoken of not as lords, but as poison, a blight upon the land, their wealth a lure that devoured all who touched it. And soon the villagers turned their suspicion into distance, refusing trade, refusing conversation, as though shunning might serve as a shield. But distance did not quiet the dread. For more than once, farmers claimed to see pale figures wandering the fields by moonlight, faces half recognized as sons once buried, voice drifting on the wind, calling names that belonged to the living. And though none dared pursue, the sightings only deepened the belief that the family had become hosts of something unholy, keepers of a secret too dark to remain hidden forever. Thus, by 1874, the Harrington name carried no respect, only fear and contempt. The dynasty regarded not as rulers, but as a curse embodied, and the village, once dependent upon their patronage, began to whisper of retribution, of fire and rope, of the need to sever ties before the contagion of their fate spread beyond the estate walls. By the summer of 1874, the Harrington dynasty no longer walked among the villagers. Their appearances at church ceased, their carriages stilled upon the roads, their gates chained not to keep thieves out, but to keep the family in. For they had heard the murmurs, felt the eyes upon them, and they knew that the village now regarded them not as lords, but as a curse made flesh. Servants who remained told of orders whispered with urgency, of shutters nailed closed against prying eyes, of pantries stocked as though for siege, for the brothers feared that the people of Dunswick, once bound by loyalty, would soon arrive not in service but in anger, bearing torches and rope to cleanse the estate of its legacy of graves. And so the family shrank inward, choosing the isolation of stone walls over the suspicion of neighbours. Yet in this withdrawal, the manor became something darker, its halls echoing with silence, its corridors stripped of laughter, the few remaining children hidden away from view, as though concealment might spare them, though none could explain from what. And the brothers, gaunt and weary, met only in candle-lit rooms, their voices rising in bitter argument, blaming one another, blaming fate, blaming sins unnamed, while outside the world whispered louder with each passing week. The estate's gardens grew wild, once tended orchards fell to rot, and the sound of bells from the village no longer carried into the windows, replaced instead by an oppressive quiet, broken only by the cawing of crows that perched upon the rooftops, black sentinels watching as though waiting for the walls themselves to surrender their secrets. And still the brothers refused to emerge, for they had chosen entombment while alive, barricading themselves within their own inheritance. But isolation is no shield from decay, and soon food began to spoil. Wells ran low, and sickness crept through the servants who remained, yet still the gates stayed locked, and those who dared call upon the manor found no answer, only shadows moving behind curtains, and the faint, unmistakable sound of weeping that carried through the stone when the wind turned right. By then the villagers spoke openly of storming the estate, but none dared yet, for what lay within was feared more than hated, a household that had become its own prison, a dynasty awaiting its own destruction, and behind the gates the Harringtons clung to walls that no longer protected them, but instead sealed them in with their curse. By the autumn of 1874, patience in Dunswick was exhausted. The people who had once whispered now spoke aloud in taverns, in marketplaces, and at the church steps, their voices heavy with resentment and dread, for they had buried too many sons of their own, while watching the Harrington line shrink into silence behind locked gates, and suspicion hardened into certainty. The dynasty was no longer cursed. It was guilty. Whispers became meetings. Meetings became plans, and men who had once ploughed the Harrington fields now sharpened scythes not for harvest, but for defence. Mothers who had lost infants to fevers pointed to the manor as the source of contagion, and old men recalled that no family could bury 49 sons without cause, that such loss was not accident but offering, a debt paid to forces unnamed, and thus the Harringtons had made themselves untouchable only by fear. By candlelight villagers gathered in barns, deciding who would go first, who would carry torches, who would demand the gates be opened, and who would force them if they were not. Yet none spoke with eagerness, for what waited within was not merely human. At least that was the belief, a belief that hollowed courage into something more desperate. For they felt that to do nothing was to consign their own bloodlines to the same grave. The church bell rang hollow that month, its sound no longer of worship, but of warning, for even the clergy had turned against the dynasty, declaring from pulpits that sin had built those stone walls, and sin would bring them down. And so the spiritual and the common joined hands, bound not by faith in God, but in fear of what the Harringtons had preserved within their manor. Children were told to remain indoors after dusk, for the roads grew tense. Each night a watch posted at the village edge, facing the manor's silhouette, a fortress looming over them like a tomb, its Wapiutaulus, indoors dark save for the occasional flicker of a candle, proof that the brothers remained alive, though to what end none could say, and each flicker drove the villagers closer to action. Thus the plan was made, a night chosen when all would gather, when silence would break beneath the march of feet and the crackle of torches, for the dynasty had shut itself away long enough, and the village no longer sought answers. It sought reckoning, and the gates of Harrington Manor would not stand forever against the tide rising below. The night chosen came without fanfare, no festival nor holiday to disguise it, only a cold wind sweeping through Dunswick as families shuttered their windows, while men and women gathered at the village edge, torches raised, their faces set with a grim resolve that had been forged over months of loss and decades of whispers. for the dynasty had ruled long enough through silence, and silence was now a crime. The march began slow, the crunch of boots over gravel carrying farther than words, each step pressing them closer to the manor that loomed like a blackened tooth against the horizon, its towers skeletal against the moon, the iron gates catching the torchlight in dull red reflections, as if already stained with what they had come to avenge. And though none spoke it, all wondered if they would return alive. At the front walked the strongest of them, farmers hardened by labour, carpenters with tools turned to weapons, widows carrying lanterns that shook with their trembling hands. Yet none faltered, for each carried the weight of a lost son, brother, or husband. And together that grief formed something stronger than fear, a tide that had long waited to strike. When they reached the gates, the crowd halted, breath steaming in the night air, the silence broken only by the crackle of torches, and all eyes turned to the great iron barrier, its bars twisted into shapes that looked more like roots than metal, entwined and thick, and many swore it had not been crafted by human hands but by something older, something that had grown as much as it had been forged. They called out then, voices rising one by one into a chorus that demanded the Harringtons show themselves, demanded the gates be opened, demanded the truth of the 49 sons laid into the soil, while the dynasty persisted as though immortal, yet no reply came, only the wind rattling across the stone walls. Carrietore, and with it, the faint sound of chains clattering somewhere deep within. The torches rose higher, the voices grew sharper, the crowd pressed closer, and iron met hammer, wood met lock, each blow ringing out like a bell tolling doom, until the gates of Harrington Manor trembled beneath their fury. And though no hand appeared on the other side, the villagers knew, with a certainty colder than the night itself, that something was waiting within. When at last the gates fell, torn from hinges that had not been moved in generations, the villagers surged forward into the grounds of Harrington Manor. But what they found inside was not the dynasty standing proud to defend its legacy, nor soldiers waiting to silence them. It was only corridors of dust, halls heavy with the stench of decay, portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow their intrusion, and silence so deep it pressed against the chest like a weight. Silence so unnatural, it was as though the house itself was holding its breath. In chamber after chamber they searched, torches cutting into the blackness, uncovering signs of lives once lived but long since abandoned. Silver goblets tarnished, cloaks draped over chairs as if their wearers had only just stepped out, papers scattered across desks with ink still legible. Yet no body, no living heir, no single Harrington to answer for what had been done. The dynasty that had buried 49 sons was gone, vanished into the marrow of its own house. Some swore they heard weeping within the walls, a child's sob pressed against stone. Others swore they saw shapes darting between doorways, pale as smoke and quick as shadow. And though they pressed higher, deeper, further into the heart of the manor, nothing was ever caught, nothing was ever held, nothing was ever explained, as though the Harrington bloodline had dissolved into the very stones that had entombed them. At dawn, when the villagers emerged, weary and shaken, they left the gates broken behind them, left the torches smouldering on the cold ground, left the manor to its silence. But what they carried back into Dunswick was worse than any treasure or any justice. They carried a truth that would never be spoken aloud, that some families are not merely cursed, but are themselves the curse, that their survival means the death of others, and that perhaps the only way the Harrington line could end was to vanish into the void it had created. Even now, more than a century later, the manor stands in ruin. The name Harrington whispered only in half-forgotten tales, yet farmers still claim the soil there grows nothing, children still vanish when they wander too near, and every 7th year a strange illness creeps through the valley and takes its toll, as though the dynasty's curse never truly ended, but waits patient for another reckoning. The Harringtons buried 49 sons. But perhaps, in truth, it was the earth itself burying us all.